So what's another way that we can test for a critical or sensitive period for language acquisition? And one answer is that we can actually look at second language learning. Why? Well, it turns out that children who learn a second language when they're young often become indistinguishable from their native-born peers. In contrast, people who are older have very different outcomes. So it seems like there's some kind of critical or sensitive period for learning a second language as well as your native language. And in fact, when we look at functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI studies that can see the neurological processing that's going on, it turns out that there's different neural processing for language in individuals, whether it's their native or in this case their second language, who learned before age 7 or 8 versus individuals who learned after this age. Again, a timing thing, a developmental stage where they seem to be doing things differently at the neural level with respect to language learning. And event-related potential, ERP studies, also confirm different neural activity, in particular left hemisphere specialization, which is in right-handed individuals anyway, is often where you will find the bulk of language processing is in the left hemisphere. And we see this in individuals who learned that second language before age 4, and that differs from the left hemisphere specialization for individuals who learn between 4 and 7 versus individuals who learned after 7. Right? So we're seeing this difference by age for second language learning. And so there was a very comprehensive start at testing age differences in second language acquisition that was done by Johnson and Newport in 1989, testing the grammatical, the linguistic abilities, the grammatical competency of Chinese and Korean native speakers who were living in the US. And in this case, these speakers who spoke Chinese and Korean natively and were learning English as a second language heard recorded voices speaking sentences and just had to judge whether these sentences were correct or natural, right, or not. So here are some examples. The farmer bought 2 pigs at the market. And, in this case, a native English speaker would recognize that you can't say 2 pig. You have to either say 2 pigs or a pig, something like that. Another one is Tom is reading book in bathtub. That's also not right. A native speaker would recognize that you would have to say something like Tom is reading a book or the book or books, right? There are different ways to fix this, but you can't just say reading book, right? Like that's an error. Okay, so lots of different questions like this. And here is really what they found, is that second language proficiency based on sort of how many items you got right on this very comprehensive, at the time, set of linguistic knowledge items with the sort of maximum around 270, that proficiency, right, so getting up to 270 out of 270 right, was dependent on the age of initial language exposure. So native level, we sort of have a baseline if you get all of them right. And if you were exposed to English between the ages of 3 to 7 and you're native Korean or Chinese speaker, but you're exposed to English before 3 to 7, you're also right up there with your native speakers in terms of your recognition and your competency in English. But then things start to drop, right? 8 to 10, now you're a little less. 11 to 15, now you're a little less. 17 to 39, now you're a lot less, right? And this is true even when you had the same number of years exposure total. So you're testing, say, speakers who have been speaking English for 30 years. It's just these are 33 to 37-year-olds, these are 38 to 40-year-olds, these are 41 to 45-year-olds rather, and so on, right? They've all been speaking the same amount, but they kind of top out at different levels of proficiency depending on their age of initial language exposure, their age of arrival, in this case, into America. And so here, if we sort of zoom in on different types of knowledge, you actually do see a difference. So for example, morphology, word pieces that go together, right? So verb agreement is the difference between saying Tom is reading a book in the bathtub versus Tom are reading a book in the bathtub. There should probably actually be books, but anyway, suffice to say, this is the agreement part, right? And if you focus in on items where the only issue was the agreement, is it Tom is or Tom are reading, right? What you see is that if you are exposed to English initially And as a native speaker, you're pretty good at recognizing these. Not perfect, right? Because, hey, humans are error prone, but you get a baseline for what native speakers do. If you're exposed starting at 4 to 6, you're quite a bit lower. I mean, not terrible, but definitely lower. And 12 years or older, you're definitely lower, right? So for morphology, these kinds of subtle word piece parts, there's a definite dip, right, based on the age of initial language exposure. Versus, actually, if you look at something like basic word order. So when we talk about basic word order, we're talking about things like subjects and verbs and objects and the order in which these things sort of normally occur in. So in English, the order is penguins like fish. Penguins is the subject because it's the one doing the liking. The liking is, in fact, the event, the verb. And the object, the thing liked, is fish. And so when you say penguins like fish, that's subject, verb, object order, which is the canonical or basic word order in English, versus something like fish penguins like, where you sort of Yodified it, right? Where it's like, now the object's up front and, penguins and like are sort of after it. That's not canonical. That's a special weirdo order that we can sometimes use in certain situations, but the canonical one is subject, verb, object. And if you look at the speaker's recognition of this kind of knowledge of basic word order, you see there doesn't really seem to be any difference, right, based on age of initial exposure, right? So not all aspects of linguistic knowledge sort of have the same problem of deteriorating, right? The older you are when you were first exposed to basic word order doesn't seem to have that same deterioration based on age of initial exposure, while morphology knowledge tends to. And so 2015 study sort of zeroed in again on different aspects of linguistic knowledge that vary. And it turns out phonology, so the sound system, the pronunciation, the accent, if you will, and certain aspects of morphosyntax, so things like agreement, how morphology little pieces of words combine together, those seem to be impacted, right, by age of initial exposure. So they are set earlier, if you will, right? And if you're not exposed to them early enough, you don't seem to get native level proficiency, while lexical knowledge, for example, knowing the word penguin, right, or knowing the word baby, right, knowing words, vocabulary, that seems to remain attainable for quite some time. It's not really as dependent on the age of initial exposure.